when you set up Pearson Lloyd, what was the reason you wanted to set up a studio?
I think we started talking about it in about 96, talking about shared interest, but Tom and I had met at the Royal College of Art in 90, and we've been talking about the sort of duality between furniture and product design, because we were on different courses at the Royal College of Art. So in a way our interest in terms of mixing these two worlds started then. We then went and worked in different practices and finally set up in 1997 with the sort of core ambition of trying to work in both an industrial design culture but also a furniture culture at the same time, which at the time was quite unusual.
Why did you want to sort of draw those two cultures together? What did you feel was missing?
Well, both of us had trained in furniture and industrial design at BA and MA, so there was a sort of a crossover in both of our thinking. I think for myself, I felt quite often product design lacked any culture. It often, there were shroudings around a piece of technology, and really there was no relationship with the technology, so people didn't quite know what to do with the outside. And then it would move on through technology very quickly, never quite having formed an archetypal sort of understanding, if that makes sense. And maybe it was the flip side for you with furniture a little bit.
Yeah, I think at the sort of at the craft end of furniture, it's about the individual and the objects and the making process. And I think I was drawn to the kind of the industrialisation of that and how furniture sits within the making process at a kind of industrial, commercial level, and so it was drifting towards the kind of commerce of industry. And I think some of the big product design studios that deal with market and commerce in a much more direct way have some advantages to it in terms of process. So, but for some reason in this country it was quite polarised in the sense of designer makers almost, and then big studios, and we kind of felt that there was a space in the middle that would kind of be where we'd be able to play both games.
Yeah. What's your design process?
Good question. I think it really depends on the project. Sometimes we design for a very specific object, a chair in wood or something like that, and it can be, it's quite a direct, quite a rational position around thinking around that object. Other times it's more about a problem, and we don't know what the object or solution might be at the end of the process. So luckily because we've chosen, in a way, we've made our lives difficult by having a very broad spectrum of work. But it means that we have, on one day we will be focusing right down on a single thing, and on another level looking at a much more macro sort of understanding of how people or spaces operate, or how bigger problems can be sort of challenged.
Well, I think in one of the overriding themes is we're very interested in trying to extrapolate from the brief what the core elements should be. So as a result, we tend to work with manufacturers and talk about the brief at the early stages and try and understand exactly what qualities should be there, or why they're there, or why we're doing it. So that's sort of key to us, even though sometimes if we're working on a simple object, the result might be quite intuitive. So it's a mix, I think, between research-based work and intuitive responses that may be based on experience and previous research projects.
Have you found that in the sort of 15 years that you've been a practice, that your process has changed, that the way that you work with brands has changed?
Well, we're doing much bigger projects now, so that forces a different approach to begin with. We're also, as I was just saying, we're much closer in terms of brief generation and brand development, whereas I think when we were started, we'd quite often get asked to do a single product, for example a chair, and in a way they want you as a designer to bring your design hand to it and nothing more. And now we're being asked to, in a way, define briefs, find gaps, look at brand development. So there's a sort of maturing at one level, and a widening perhaps of breadth of what we're actually doing.
And we've always, from the very beginning, we said that we didn't really want to do our own work that we would then try and sell to a manufacturer, to a brand, to a company. So the process of working with whoever it is an incredibly important part of our process, coming back to your earlier question. We like the tension of that person on the other side of the table, challenging us about, does it cost this much, is it this problem, is it this material, is it this country, is it this... All those things are the things that build up a sense of story around the project.
You've spoken a lot before about what you call the craft of industry. What do you mean by that?
I think it's a bit like, craft has always been, pure craft has been given this sort of credibility around the fact that someone spends 10,000 hours learning how to be a silversmith or learning how to be a potter. And I think sometimes industrial design is seen as the process of producing mass-produced objects has never kind of been given that respect, if you like. And we think that there's just as much of a challenge and a skill and a learning process in understanding how to produce, how to use design to produce good quality mass production. And so it's a sort of paradoxical statement, if you like, between the craft of industry, but it is how do you minimise materials, how do you make the most of machinery, how do you affect good price, how do you improve performance. All those things are things I think you learn, not only based on talent or instinct. It's actually stuff that it's based on experience. And so it's not something you can come straight out of college and achieve, because you make mistakes. It's just like the potter, you make mistakes and you throw away half your work, and slowly you end up being able to do, a piece that you can be proud of. And I think it's a similar kind of process.
Yeah, I think it is complex, and it does take time. I think the analogy with the potter's quite a good one, because I think the other thing that you get as a craft process is direct feedback. It's often straight from your fingertips, so you've got a sort of direct intrinsic relationship from the eye to the hand. And when you're designing for mass production, you don't. Quite often it'll go through CAD to a tool maker, it'll then go into a tool, and then some other process takes place. So the final result is removed from your fingertips in many, many ways. And in fact, it takes a lot of knowledge and experience to bring together all the elements in the right process to actually control the final result. It's a very different kind of thinking. But I think what we're kind of trying to do at all times is bring that knowledge to play so that we're finding the right process, the right design solutions for the industrial technique, in the same way that a potter isn't going to try and make, a completely flat-sided pot. It doesn't work like that.
I mean, you've worked throughout pretty much all of your practice. You've always worked with industry. So what is it about this space that you like working in? Why is it sort of that you gear all of your products to sort of mass production?
I think some of it's political, in the sense that I think it's great to do design work that has a broad user base. Some of it's just the fact that I think designers, and I think Luke and I share the thing of, like most designers, it's quite thrilling to go into a factory and see things being made, and to actually see the process of converting the materials into finished products in large numbers is a remarkable kind of feat.
Yeah.
But also we enjoy being a part of a process, from the user all the way down to the kind of raw material producer, and that dialogue between the engineer and the user and the market is a kind of very energetic one that I think we both celebrate.
I think additionally to that, the cultural dialogue that you get through working in different areas, in different languages, in different places around the world, informs the thinking very differently. So Tacchini, for example, have a very particular approach, which would be very different from, say, working with a big American company. And those things allow us to exercise or flex different muscles in terms of our design thinking. So we can sort of learn from one territory, one area, one culture, and bring that forwards sometimes subliminally and sometimes very consciously, to another place. So for us, it keeps the process fresh. We feel like we're learning, which I guess is the ultimate goal for any designer.
All of your work to date has been for mass production, and I'm interested in hearing about what it is about that space that you like to work in. Is it something to do with the restrictions? You know,
I think we've always found that a brief creates a very good sort of creative tension for us as a springboard, and it could be anything from we have to use this material to it has to be this price to it's for this market, or so, and that whole dialogue with all those different elements it's a bit like someone asking you to write a story and you kind of freeze. Whereas if you're asked to write a story about a boy in a forest or something, it sort of builds up and your imagination starts to feed into that process. And I think that's the energy of also, because we work across different countries and different types of clients, we get a different energy out of each one of those relationships. And that's also feeds, it kind of keeps a fresh, kind of energetic kind of part of our work.
I think you answered my bad.
Okay. Want to do it again?
Well,
it doesn't matter, Luke. We're gonna.
Okay, well, let's just move on then.
Okay.
What are the sort of themes that underpin a lot of your work? Are there kind of themes that hold it together?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. There's a certain rational approach to what we do, but we're also looking to surprise both ourselves and our audience, but in a kind of quiet way. So sometimes our work is very sculptural, but that sculptural can be sort of, in a way, fluid, or it can be quite abstract and architectural, as an example. We're interested in beauty, and that's it's a very old-fashioned sort of idea, but I think designers always wanted to bring beauty to the world. And that combination of kind of beauty and solving problems is I suppose, where design exists. And so in a way, they're probably not unique concepts, but they are foundations to our process.
And efficiency, I think, is something we've always been interested in, but it's probably becoming much more important going forwards, especially when we're working with big clients and big projects. Small quantities of material have a huge impact in terms of resources and the embedded energy that is included in anything. So I think that's also coupled to the knowledge and experience that we were talking about earlier. You have more tools at your disposal to design. You have more knowledge, and you can also see things in a more rounded way. Quite often ideas about ecology and environmental issues are fashionable, and you have to be able to sift through that and work out what's really important.
What do you mean by efficiency?
Efficiency, two things really. One, in terms of the build, how do you get a solution in the most efficient way? So on a simple way of describing it, it's good engineering, good use of materials, well designed in terms of its construction, its assembly, but also efficient in terms of how it actually performs with the user. So we're very interested in the idea of ergonomics, both sort of emotional and physical. How an object appears changes how you interact with it, and then when you interact with it, that changes how you perceive it. So there's quite a strong crossover between physical and emotional with the work as well. So we're interested in playing with those notions.
What would you say sort of Pearson Lloyd ethos is? What are the kind of values of your brand?
I think we have multiple interests. I think there's a number of values. I think longevity is something we tend to try and maybe smooth off the sharp edges that might make something a little bit too fashionable, a bit too ephemeral. That's one thing. We do, as Tom was just saying then, I think a kind of quiet experimentation. We try and create a kind of progress, but with a limited risk perhaps. There's probably a number of ways of describing the things we're interested in.
Yeah, and we're interested in allowing things to, I think as Luke talked about trends and fashion, we like the idea that things have a lasting impact. And so that also constrains, in a way, the work itself to a space in order for it not to be fashionable, if that makes sense. So we're interested in sidestepping some of those issues so that things can last a long time. And we work in different sectors where they have to last a long time. So we've just been working on all the street products for Bath, for the city of Bath, and the expected lifespan is 40 years for the products. So we have to but work within a kind of culture and an aesthetic and a set of principles that has longevity. And so that sets up its own challenges and also its own sort of dynamics that we're really interested in.
And what's about sort of core values is so you've talked about kind of beauty and efficiency.
One of the things we have an ongoing theme around is this idea that design should be a shared experience. So the users of design, we're all using design at the same time. And whether that's in a kind of any public environment like a city or a transport system or a workplace, design isn't only about an individual object, it's about how objects allow groups of people to interact with each other in a sort of successful way. And so often you see design photographed on its own without people. There's that whole culture which we know architecture's also guilty of. And we want to understand, we want to try and build a dialogue where the user and the collective experience is just as important as the individual object. Of course, we're still interested in the individual object, but we want to see it in the context of a sort of group and a shared dynamic.
I think maybe one word that springs to mind is a kind of democracy. I think we're interested in the work being democratic and having a kind of neutrality. So we tend to shy away from very luxurious territories, and we tend to shy away from huge mass market sort of projects. So I think that's conscious, and a lot of the work that we do in the contract furniture market, it only works well if it works well for the user, because it's not really down to personal taste. It's performing with people that haven't necessarily chosen to use it. It's supplied for them to use, and therefore it has to work. It's not down to taste. It's beyond that.
When you talk about sort of that your work is democratic, what do you mean more specifically?
Accessible. I think it's functional. So a lot of the work, as we were touching on earlier, is based around solving problems. It provides solutions for people. We get a client coming to us with a definitive brief that asks a specific question, or we help them to hone that question, and then hopefully we provide a solution for that. So that itself is a kind of democratic response.
The term design thinking often comes up when you're talking about your design process, and it's a very overused, frequently used term, and consequently its definition is quite muddled. So what does it mean to you? How does it sort of materialise in actual work?
I'm confused by the sort of excessive use of design thinking, because for me it's just what any designer should be doing, and it's what any process that involves designers should embody. I think designers on their own, depending on the project, can be quite isolated. So they should be going out and asking questions. They should be entering into dialogue with the right stakeholders, and the right dialogue should be generated. So I think in lots of ways it's being used it's quite often used with co-design, which is another sort of new term. But I think in lots of ways good design has always filtered conversations and dialogue. At the end of the day, you need somebody to produce the object. I think in situations where it's not necessarily producing a three-dimensional object, it might be producing a service, then maybe it's got more, let's say, more use as a term, because it's less down to the individual crafting a solution. It's more down to a group of people different stakeholders bringing issues together.
So thinking is a kind of practice in itself.
Yes.
Rather than having to. So do you think there's a kind of role for designers now to take that thinking and produce actual working products?
I think they always have. Maybe we're just witnessing a maturing of the dialogue that surrounds design, and maybe it's healthy in that quite often I think design, we've sort of perhaps been through a 20-year period where design's increased in its usage of the word design, and a lot of the times it's not design, it's styling. So I think we've sort of come full circle where now people are able to contextualise design, or are beginning to contextualise design and what it can do, what it is as a tool. And obviously thinking is an absolutely invaluable part of that.
But I still think you need enlightened clients to understand that designers can make that contribution. I think in the past, designers are expected to sort of do the very end of the process when a lot of that pre-work has already been done. And I think if we can sort of swim upstream a bit and have that influence on why you're doing a project, how you might solve the problem, I think that's where the sort of strategic aspect of the industry can have more of an impact.
So you're redesigning the brief in a sense in order to sort of produce the kind of work that you feel is needed.
Exactly, and I think design's often been said that it's kind of, bridges sort of art and science, and I think sometimes we are the only people who can talk to the engineers and talk to the market, and somehow we've got a big enough contextual overview of the process to spot where the conflicts might be. Because often you get these different parts of the process converging without actually talking to each other. And so I think we can design can short circuit some of those potential problems by having more in-depth conversations earlier in the process.
And also I think the validity of doing that increases, because quite often when you're doing a project with a company, they'll have done that project once. The people that have worked on that project have done that once. So there's quite often a lack of experience at the coalface, and I think one of the benefits of using designers is that they've got experience in so many different areas, and it's historical because that's all we do for a living. So, for example, we've been doing it for 20 years, so when we come to any problem, even if it's not a problem that we've directly done before, we've got experience that we can bring from other areas. Right? That, without doubt, can be used very efficiently at the brief building stage to help and assist the client to ask the right questions from the outset. And a good project really only comes out of a good brief.
You have to actually have a part in creating that brief. I guess that's becoming increasingly part of the design work.
And I think actually it folds back into design of efficiency, because if you design the wrong object, then you're wasting your time and your energy and your money and your resources. So sometimes spending a little bit more time identifying the right projects has a much greater impact in terms of resources and longevity of the objects themselves, or of the service, or of the system.
Do you think the relationship between the designer and the client needs to become a bit more, or shift a little, so that the conversation from the very start is more fluid?
Yes, ideally. I mean, we're lucky, for example, with Tacchini, the relationship is very fluid, and it's as much based on an emotional feeling, so we'll talk around you. And that gives you, on one level it's a blank sheet of paper and it's quite scary. But I think the worst thing that you can get is a client who thinks they know what they want, and they're just bringing you in to provide a skill.
They need stylists.
Yes, and they're missing so much opportunity in terms of that other person's point of view. And it's one of the reasons why we set up a partnership, is because you can get quite fixed on thinking you're right, and you only need one person to throw in a question at the right moment and say, what if we did it like this? So I think dialogue throughout the process, and sort of the critical analysis and challenging in a positive way allow you to build briefs that can develop from sort of identification of the brief to actually modifying the brief right to the last moment before you actually get to tooling. or maybe even in terms of how you present the object, how you develop and deliver the narrative. That's all a design process.
You sort of spoken in the past about how you sort of straddle a place between IDEO and a kind of, I guess, furniture designer or product designer. There's a sort of space in between. Is that how you would describe your practice?
I don't know, what do you think?
I think we touch both ends of the spectrum, and we've maybe made our lives difficult by wanting to, because we enjoy doing individual crafted design, and we enjoy also tackling very difficult social, sort of service-based problems. Maybe we'll come to regret that, but I think we like the challenge. We like taking on difficult problems, not knowing what the solution might be, and we also like trying to find poetic sort of responses to very particular briefs. So in a way, it's okay. Sometimes it's hard to communicate in terms of what we are, but we also quite like surprising people in taking on projects that maybe people would be surprised by us doing.
Yes, I think when we started out, quite often we go and meet a client and they say, well, what makes you think you can do this kind of project because you've never done this before? Which we found very negative, because we sort of illustrate the fact that we had those skills by showing them what we did with another project in another sort of territory, another industry. But we found that quite often people are very linear in their thinking. So I think for a small studio, and we're relatively small compared with some of the big studios, that becomes a problem which takes a long time to establish the credentials to show somebody we can do that, the track record. But I think now that's much less the case, because we have some huge projects that you might have come out of a big studio, and it's not actually the scale that's needed, it's just the thinking. Obviously you need to build a team to support that, but that's relatively easy to do. It's understanding how to go about the project, that's the difficult thing.
I mean, as you said, you've got sort of projects that span such a spectrum, sort of in healthcare, and sort of your work for Lufthansa, Tacchini. Do you find that your process is the same for these different projects, or do you have to change the way that you work depending on the kind of brief that you're given and the client that you're working with?
I think it changes, and I think it's probably what keeps us feeling enthusiastic, because sometimes some projects you can come in and have just a feeling, it can be intuition. Of course it's never quite intuition because it's based on experience, and other projects you have to go through a very formal process of looking at the problem on the brief, because you really don't know what's the solution. You don't have a feeling what the solution could be, like the A&E project that we did, which was very, very different. We didn't know whether we were going to produce a physical product as an outcome, whether it was going to be architectural, and in the end it was as much a communication project as anything, because in fact the process of looking made us realise that if you could just illustrate to the customer and the staff where they were in this journey, then the confusion would be sort of demystified. So in a way, the problem of the project gave us the solution, which was an unpredicted outcome.
Can you just explain briefly the project? Very briefly, just the name.
Do you run through that?
Well, the brief was trying to tackle the problems of violence and aggression in emergency departments, and that's a very open concept. Actually, the main focus of the project was around, or rather the problems that create the most heat and light are sort of alcoholic and drug affected incidents where people create a large impact, a fight, a big amount of noise in space. We actually decided not to try and tackle those particular people, because we observed that there's a kind of undercurrent of aggression, and that any one of us sort of ends up feeling when you go into an emergency department and feel underserved by the process. You're in a state of shock, fear, anxiety, and then somehow things aren't quite working. as Luke says, the end result was that if we could just allow people to understand what the process that they were going through was, the frustration that leads to aggression would be kind of softened. So it was a kind of very interesting socio-psychological sort of idea and project that's still very much in its infancy. It's in 4 hospitals currently in the UK, and we're only now beginning to see the results of the work.